what would you, is your most, you talked about Alan Jeffries, but you think about probably what's your thought of the best or the couple of best special rangers or cattle raisers that you worked with during your career?
Well, I think Don King, when I worked, I thought he was one of the sharpest and real, aggressive, and he was ready to go 24/7, and and he had good perception. And, he could tell whether there's a chance in coming up with something there on that. And then, of course, I respected Alan, but he wasn't a tough, mean old feller, and I never seen Alan. He wore a badge and inspected all the time, but I don't ever remember seeing him wearing a pistol. He just done it work with and had one in the car and stuff, and worked for probably 40 years for the cattle raisers. But he is pretty respected fella. I remember one time when one of the banks bought the other bank across the street out there in Clarendon, and they said when Allen had money in both of them, and they said when he wore a gun then, but that he went down there, and when they walked across the street with the money to this other bank, he walked across there with them, and but
Going back to that on Allen, what is the history of him with the blackleg vaccine?
well, when Franklin's, they had a ranch up there in that country north of McLean. I've been to it a lot of times myself, the old Franklin Ranch, and they made the first blackleg vaccine ever made. That was the originator. I didn't know anybody when I was first starting out. I didn't know anybody else made blackleg medicine but Franklin's. All of it I'd ever seen was Franklin's. And Allen carried that. Ranchers wouldn't use it because they didn't vaccinate then. And they just took the loss of the blackleg in their calves in August when it hits them, and they lose some every year. But they were skeptical of, just like people are skeptical of this COVID vaccine now. They wouldn't use it, but he carried it in the back of his car in the trunk and had a deal with Franklin's that he'd encourage and get people to using it. And when they was branding or working, well, he'd furnish medicine for them, sometimes give it to them if you'll try it, and then he'd deliver it and sell it to them then for years, just in his line of duty while he handled the blackleg. It is just a 2cc blackleg shot for, but a lot of ranches wouldn't use it because they're skeptical of that vaccinating them for something, and it's hard for us to imagine now or looking back why they wouldn't, but he didn't. But he got credit for helping to get it started in that big area up there, and he hauled it on the train when he'd go ride the caboose to different places where they're shipping cattle. He'd have some with him, some blackleg, and then he'd sold it and kept people in it, and supposedly made a lot of money to sell it. And that's well, I guess I should research that before I say, but I imagine that it'd be in about 41 that they got that made in the late 30s and Allen started hauling it. But I remember a lot of people telling me that Allen carried blackleg in the back of his car for a long time. till it got to where everybody, and then so many companies making it. Then Franklin's was the only ones that had it, and no, and a lot of them now, like Blackleg now, is 5 cc's. All of it I've seen a long time, but then it is just a 2 cc shot, and you could carry a whole bunch of it in 2 or 3 cases in the back of your car.
There was a story I heard that association in the 40s had a tough financial year or two, and Allen had done well enough with that Blackleg, and kind of as a reward for them allowing him to carry it in the trunk, that he helped them financially through those rough years.
Well, I've heard that too, and I don't know. I know that Allen told me that during the heart of the Depression, the association told him they couldn't pay him, but if he'd stay on the job and keep that old car and keep working, any dues he could collect from broke ranchers, why just use that for living expense, and they'd settle up with him when this broke. And it's like 2 or 3 years, he told me later, I think 35 or 6 along there, that they went to turning it around, and they back paid him then, he said, for all them. Several of them, the Rowe Ranch done that there at Clarendon. They told their men that they couldn't pay them, but they would furnish their groceries. They'd pay the grocery bill for your board and tobacco if you'll work and stay on the job. And when this breaks, if we can, we'll settle. And they had several men that I know personally that stayed, and they 2 or 3 years later they back paid them for all them wages back there that they missed. It's Jake Chamberlain, Kurt Vaughn, and Cicero Turpin. They're old cowboys that I knew there when I was a young man that stayed with them through that period, and they paid them for it. But Mr. Rowe that founded that ranch went down on the Titanic, and it was his heirs that operated. He was on the Titanic, had been to Europe to borrow money from them big banks where the money was over then. And the story that I've been told, he had and this wouldn't be no money for a big operation now, but he had $1 million in a briefcase coming home, and took it down with him on the ship.
Did you know a special ranger inspector named Fish Wilson?
Oh yes, yeah, I knew Fish. His name was Maynard Wilson. Called him Fish because of his mouth. He was kind of looked like a fish, and he was an old bachelor and lived at Quay. He worked for the J.A.'s when he was a young fellow, a long time as a cowboy there at Clarendon. And then Allen got him that job, Allen Jeffries got him, put him down there because Allen was having to go down in there so much. He got him to put an inspector down there and just work on it. And he worked up till he had to retire. He lived to be 91 or 2, and he died there, Quay.
And I believe maybe you carried Fish into the Fort Worth office one of the first times he went in.
No, he was in the Fort Worth office, yeah, and met some people, and they said that shook hands and talking, and these folks, he told them he is Fish Wilson from Quay, and he said, yeah, if y'all can't think of Wilson, just think of Quay. I'm the only one there, and the people in the office, all of them thought anybody that couldn't think of Wilson would have trouble with Quay. But he was a good old man. He was more of a brandy inspector in the field than a peace officer. Fish just worked shipments and those checked on strays and stuff. And I never did think much of him as an investigator or something, you know.
What about a Special Ranger Inspector Dutch Lumen?
Yeah, Dutch was he was a bad hombre, and you know, he had killed 2 or 3 men and had been indicted for murder a time or two, and then been to the pen. And then the association hired him when he was eligible to get out. They wanted a tough guy to go to Borger, and they was having a lot of trouble with Borger. And he went up there and stayed the rest of his life, died up there. It worked for him for a number of years. When I was a little kid, I remember I think I told you, I see one morning I remember at that ranch where I lived in the Panhandle, there's a coupe car with a cot beside it out in the horse pasture there. And I asked my daddy, I said, who's that man stayed out there last night? And he said, that's Dutch Lumen. He'd just stay wherever it got dark and stayed out long periods at a time. He wouldn't come back in. They wouldn't nobody know where he was, you know. And they sent him with me when I wished I could think of the man's name, but there's a fella out of Lubbock, and he is a rich cotton farmer raised at Wellington, and he bought the 200 sections of that Trohier country from the Matadors up there between Adrian and Glen Rio, New Mexico. And then he was unhappy with he said there's supposed to be like 2,800 cows on the deal, and he didn't think they was there, and he thought that they put it on him there. And the association sent me and Dutch Lumen, and Alan Jeffries run the books for us, but he didn't ride. Dutch rode with me every day, and 5 or 6 cowboys, and we went up there and we'd just round a bunch. There's 100 sections in one of them pastures, but we'd just throw a bunch together and count them out behind us, and then throw another bunch together and count them behind us. And we went 3 or 4 days staying out there in our bedrolls in a house that was out there. And then I met with that gentleman in Amarella in a motel and gave him that report, and he offered me the job running it. But at that time I was with association and didn't want to quit. But I can't remember his name now, but I remember quite a bit about him. I remember he had some of the beautifulest gold teeth fixed really nice, and I remarked about it one time, who done that? And he said, well, a young dentist in Lubbock done this work, and he asked me during that period how I had been so successful and made so much money. And he said, I told him, I can tell you this, young man, I didn't try to get it all off one man. I guess that dentist had been charging him pretty good for them teeth, but I can't remember that guy's name.
Did you ever work with any of them? There were a couple of peelers, Travis Peeler and Graves Peeler, that worked for us.
Yeah. Travis was still working when I went to work, and Graves had retired and had a little operation of his own there at Kingsville. I never worked directly with them, but I was with them at the conventions and when we'd be there. Travis was the active inspector at Kingsville, and when he retired, Leonard Stiles took that job. And
Leonard had come from the King Ranch. Leonard had come from the King Ranch, hadn't
No, he went to the King Ranch when he left the association. He went to work as a manager of the Santa Gertrudis division and worked there till right up when he died. He had that good brand collection. I think he gave it to the association, didn't he?
It's in the museum.
Yeah, it's in the museum. He had the best good brand collection, and his wife was a Spanish lady, and Leonard and all of his children were fluent in Spanish. And
did you ever hear any of the stories about Graves' Feeler? There's some stories that he was pretty mean in his early days.
yeah, I can't something I can't relate, but I've been told that Travis and Graves both were. See, they were old men in the '60s, so they was, probably born '98 or somewhere along there, 1898 or so, and they were getting on up in the years when I knew them. But I met them both, and Travis was still on the employ as an inspector, but I know that they were pretty tough hombres, and it was a different time, and they were in a pretty bad area, there. Them boys there at the King Ranch, even Leonard Stiles was pretty tough hombre. They made a lot of the rules as they went,